To keep seeing more stories, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you like this video, share your feedback in the comments section. The courtroom humiliation. The silent target. The fluorescent lights in courtroom 7 cast harsh shadows across the tired faces of everyone present. Victoria Hayes sat at the defendant's table wearing a simple gray dress she had purchased from a discount store 3 days earlier. Her hair was pulled back in a plain ponytail, and her hands rested quietly in her lap. She looked like someone who had already lost everything. Across the aisle, Brandon Hayes adjusted his expensive silk tie and smiled at his lawyer. He looked every bit the successful businessman he claimed to be. His custom Italian suit probably cost more than most people earned in a month. He glanced at Victoria with barely concealed contempt, the same look he had given her countless times during their marriage. Christine Monroe stood before the judge, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor. She was known throughout New York as the lawyer who never lost divorce cases. Her reputation was built on destroying opponents, and today she seemed particularly eager to add another victory to her record. The attack begins. Christine began her opening statement with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. She painted Victoria as a woman who had contributed nothing to the marriage, who had lived off Brandon's hard work and success. According to Christine, Victoria had spent her days shopping online and watching television while Brandon built his real estate empire from nothing. The gallery behind them whispered and murmured. Most of the spectators were Brandon's friends and business associates. They had come to watch what they thought would be an easy victory. Some of them had even made bets on how quickly the case would end. Judge Thomas Bradford listened with a neutral expression. He was an older man with gray hair and kind eyes, but years on the bench had taught him to show no emotion during proceedings. He gestured for Christine to continue. The mockery intensifies. Christine pulled out financial documents and began reading them aloud. She detailed every dollar Brandon had earned, every property he had purchased, every investment he had made. Then she turned to Victoria's financial statement. The contrast was deliberately dramatic. According to the documents Christine presented, Victoria had earned less than $15,000 in the past year. She had listed her occupation as freelance consultant, but Christine made it sound like a joke. The gallery laughed on cue, and Brandon joined them. Victoria remained perfectly still. She did not flinch when Christine called her lazy. She did not react when someone in the gallery called her a gold digger. Her face was a mask of calm acceptance, but anyone who looked closely at her eyes would have seen something else. Something cold and calculating, like a chess player watching their opponent walk into a trap. Memories surface. As Christine continued her verbal assault, Victoria's mind drifted to the past. She remembered the day she had met Brandon at a charity event 5 years earlier. He had been charming, attentive, and ambitious. She had been impressed by his drive, his determination to succeed. What she had not seen then was the darkness beneath his polished exterior. Their courtship had been quick. Brandon had swept her off her feet with expensive dinners, weekend trips, and constant attention. He had proposed after only 4 months, presenting her with a massive diamond ring at a fancy restaurant. She had said yes, believing she had found someone who truly loved her. The wedding had been extravagant. Brandon had insisted on inviting hundreds of people, most of whom Victoria had never met. He had controlled every detail, from the flowers to the menu to the music. At the time, Victoria had thought he was just being helpful. Later, she would understand it was his need to control everything around him, the isolation. After the wedding, things had changed gradually. Brandon had suggested Victoria quit her job to focus on being a good wife. He had said he earned enough for both of them. Foolishly, she had agreed, not realizing she was cutting off her independence. He had discouraged her from maintaining friendships. When her college friends invited her out, Brandon would create reasons why she should stay home. When her sister called, he would interrupt conversations or create distractions. Slowly, systematically, he had isolated her from everyone who cared about her. He had criticized her constantly. Her clothes were never right. Her cooking was never good enough. Her opinions were naive and uninformed. Every day had brought new ways for Brandon to make her feel small and worthless. He had never raised his hand to her, but his words had been weapons just as damaging. The breaking point. The final straw had come 6 months earlier. Victoria had discovered text messages on Brandon's phone. He had been having an affair with Christine Monroe for over a year. When Victoria confronted him, Brandon had not even bothered to deny it. Instead, he had laughed and told her she should be grateful he had stayed with her as long as he had. He had filed for divorce the next day, confident that Victoria would accept whatever scraps he offered. After all, what choice did she have? She had no job, no money, no support system. Brandon had made sure of that. The present moment. Christine's voice brought Victoria back to the present. The lawyer was now asking the judge to award Brandon everything and force Victoria to pay his legal fees. She argued that Victoria had wasted the court's time with frivolous claims and deserved to be punished for her greed. Brandon nodded along enthusiastically. He turned to his friends in the gallery and gave them a thumbs up. Several of them laughed and applauded quietly. They thought they were watching a woman being put in her place. Judge Bradford looked at Victoria with something that might have been pity. He asked if she had legal representation. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the courtroom doors swung open with a bang that echoed through the chamber. Everyone turned to look at the entrance. What they saw made the entire room fall silent. The unexpected arrival. The power entrance. 3 men walked through the courtroom doors with the kind of confidence that comes from never having lost a battle. They wore matching charcoal suits that whispered wealth and power with every step. Their leather briefcases were handcrafted, the kind that cost more than most cars. But it was the man in the center who commanded attention. Lawrence Whitmore was a legend in legal circles. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his posture impeccable. He had represented presidents, royal families, and Fortune 500 companies. He did not handle divorce cases. He handled billion-dollar mergers and international treaties. His hourly rate was rumored to start at $10,000, and he only took cases that interested him personally. Brandon felt his stomach drop. He grabbed Christine's arm so hard she winced. Christine's face had gone pale. She recognized Lawrence Whitmore immediately. Every lawyer in New York knew who he was. He was the kind of attorney you hoped never appeared on the opposing side of your case. Lawrence walked past the stunned gallery without acknowledging anyone. His assistants followed behind him like well-trained soldiers. He stopped directly in front of Victoria's table and set down his briefcase with deliberate precision. The revelation begins. Lawrence spoke in a voice that was cultured and calm, but it carried absolute authority. He apologized to Judge Bradford for the delayed arrival, explaining that his helicopter had encountered unexpected weather conditions. The casual mention of a private helicopter sent another wave of shock through the courtroom. Judge Bradford leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He asked Lawrence to confirm his identity and purpose. Lawrence handed over his credentials with a slight smile. He was here to represent Victoria Hayes in this divorce proceeding. Brandon shot to his feet. His face had turned red, veins visible in his neck. He demanded to know how Victoria could possibly afford Lawrence Whitmore. His voice cracked with panic and disbelief. Victoria turned to look at her husband for the first time since the proceedings began. The meek expression was gone. In its place was something that made Brandon take an involuntary step backward. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and utterly without fear. The truth starts unfolding. Victoria spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. She explained that she had not hired Lawrence Whitmore. He was already on retainer. He worked for her company. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Christine found her voice first. She demanded clarification. What company? According to all their research, Victoria had no employment, no business interests, no assets worth mentioning. Lawrence opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. He began placing them on the table one by one. Corporate filings. Stock certificates. Property deeds. Bank statements. Each document told a story that contradicted everything Brandon and his lawyer believed they knew. Victoria stood up slowly. The transformation was remarkable. The hunched shoulders straightened. The timid expression vanished. She looked like a different person entirely, someone who belonged in boardrooms and executive suites. The marriage unveiled. Lawrence began presenting the facts in chronological order. 5 years ago, Victoria Bennett had been the owner of Bennett Consulting Group, a private equity firm that specialized in commercial real estate investments. The company was privately held and operated under strict confidentiality agreements. Victoria preferred to keep her business dealings separate from her personal life. When she met Brandon Hayes, he was a junior real estate agent working for a small firm. He had big dreams but limited resources. Victoria had been impressed by his ambition, though she later realized she had confused ambition with ruthlessness. After their wedding, Victoria had made a decision. She wanted to see if Brandon truly loved her or if he was attracted to her potential wealth. She had hidden her business identity, presenting herself as a simple freelance consultant. She had wanted a partner who valued her as a person, not as a bank account. Brandon had proposed a prenuptial agreement before the wedding. Victoria had signed it without argument. What Brandon did not know was that the agreement only covered assets he was aware of at the time. Since he had never bothered to ask about her work or finances, he had no idea what he was actually protecting. The business connection. Lawrence continued laying out documents. 2 years into the marriage, Brandon had started his own real estate company. Hayes Properties had launched with what Brandon claimed was a loan from a private investor. He had bragged to everyone about his business acumen and ability to secure funding. The truth was different. The investor was a shell corporation owned by Bennett Consulting Group. Victoria had funded her husband's entire business without his knowledge. She had wanted to support his dreams while protecting herself from his increasingly controlling behavior. Over 3 years, Victoria had invested over $5 million into Hayes Properties. Every major deal Brandon had closed, every property he had acquired, every expansion he had celebrated had been made possible by her money. Brandon thought he was a self-made success story. In reality, he was being bankrolled by the wife he treated with contempt. Rebecca Sinclair entered the courtroom at that moment. She was a tall woman with dark hair and sharp features, dressed in a burgundy power suit. She carried herself with the confidence of someone used to making million-dollar decisions before breakfast. The partner arrives. Lawrence introduced Rebecca as the Chief Operating Officer of Bennett Consulting Group and Victoria's business partner of 12 years. Rebecca had flown in from London specifically for this hearing. She placed her own briefcase on the table and pulled out additional documents. Rebecca explained that she had advised Victoria against hiding her identity from Brandon. She had warned that men who needed to feel superior often reacted badly when they discovered the truth. Victoria had insisted on giving Brandon a chance to prove his character. Unfortunately, Brandon had failed that test repeatedly. Brandon was now sitting down, his face ashen. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse. Christine was frantically flipping through the documents Lawrence had provided, trying to find some angle, some way to salvage her case. Judge Bradford asked Victoria directly why she had allowed this situation to continue for so long. Why had she let her husband believe he was the breadwinner when she was actually funding everything? Victoria's testimony. Victoria's voice was steady as she answered. She explained that love sometimes makes people foolish. She had hoped that Brandon would eventually see her as an equal partner. She had believed that if she gave him space to succeed, he would grow into a better person. Instead, Brandon had become more controlling and dismissive. He had belittled her constantly, making her feel worthless in her own home. The final insult had come when she discovered his affair with Christine. Even then, Victoria had been willing to end things quietly until Brandon had filed for divorce demanding that she walk away with nothing. She spoke about the isolation, the constant criticism, the systematic destruction of her self-confidence. Her voice never wavered, but there was pain beneath the calm exterior. The gallery, which had been laughing earlier, now sat in uncomfortable silence. Brandon tried to interrupt several times, but Judge Bradford ordered him to remain silent. Christine attempted to object, claiming this was all irrelevant to the financial matters at hand. Lawrence calmly pointed out that character and intent were absolutely relevant in divorce proceedings. The documentary evidence. Rebecca began presenting financial records that painted a damning picture. Every time Brandon had celebrated a business victory, the actual money had come from Victoria's accounts. Every time he had bragged about his negotiating skills, Victoria's team had actually structured the deals behind the scenes. The prenuptial agreement Brandon had been so proud of was worthless. It protected his assets, but he had no significant assets that were actually his own. Meanwhile, Victoria's holdings were extensive and completely separate from anything covered by the agreement. Lawrence pulled out email records showing Brandon's communications with Christine. The affair had started during a business dinner where Brandon had been trying to impress the lawyer with his wealth and success. The messages showed him complaining about Victoria, calling her boring and useless. He had promised Christine that once the divorce was final, they would live lavishly on his fortune. The courtroom shifts. The atmosphere in the courtroom had completely changed. The people who had been laughing at Victoria now avoided looking at her. Brandon's friends in the gallery were suddenly very interested in their phones. Christine looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. Judge Bradford asked Brandon if he had any response to these revelations. Brandon opened his mouth several times but no words came out. He looked at Christine desperately, but she had no answers for him. How could she defend against the truth? Victoria remained standing throughout the presentation. She had not raised her voice once. She had not gloated or celebrated. She had simply allowed the facts to speak for themselves. True power, as she had learned long ago, did not need to shout. Lawrence concluded the first phase of his presentation by requesting a short recess. He indicated that there were additional documents to review, but he wanted to give everyone time to process the information already presented. Judge Bradford agreed and called for a 30-minute break. The truth unveiled. The recess tension. The courtroom remained frozen for several seconds after Judge Bradford announced the break. Nobody seemed willing to move first. Finally, Brandon stood up so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He stormed toward the exit without looking at anyone, his face red with humiliation and rage. Christine gathered her papers with shaking hands. She had built her reputation on destroying opponents in divorce court, but she had never faced someone like Victoria. The documents Lawrence had presented were irrefutable. Every claim she had made about Victoria being a parasite now looked foolish and cruel. Victoria walked to the window overlooking the city. Rebecca joined her, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. They spoke quietly while Lawrence reviewed additional files with his assistants. The gallery slowly emptied, with Brandon's friends whispering urgently to each other as they left. In the hallway outside, Brandon was pacing like a caged animal. His business associates kept their distance, suddenly remembering urgent appointments elsewhere. One by one, they made excuses and disappeared. The man they had admired for his success story was revealed as nothing more than a puppet dancing on strings he never knew existed, the truth about Hayes Properties. When court resumed, Lawrence stood and requested permission to present additional evidence. Judge Bradford nodded, his expression now showing clear interest in the case. This was no longer a simple divorce hearing. It was becoming a masterclass in hidden power and carefully planned revelation. Lawrence called Rebecca to the witness stand. She was sworn in and took her seat with professional composure. Lawrence began asking questions that painted an even more detailed picture of Victoria's business empire. Rebecca testified that Bennett Consulting Group had been founded 15 years ago with Victoria as the sole owner. The company had grown from a small investment firm into a major player in commercial real estate. They owned properties in 12 countries and managed a portfolio worth over $300 million. The gallery gasped. Even Judge Bradford looked surprised. Christine objected weakly, claiming these numbers were unverified, but Lawrence produced certified financial statements from 3 separate international accounting firms. The numbers were real. Rebecca continued her testimony. She explained how Victoria had personally vetted every investment opportunity, how she had built relationships with developers and city planners, how she had created a network that spanned the globe. Victoria was not just wealthy. She was brilliant at business. The Hayes Properties connection. Then came the revelation that made Brandon slump in his chair. Rebecca pulled out incorporation documents for Hayes Properties. According to the official records, the company had 3 shareholders. Brandon owned 30%. The remaining 70% was split between 2 investment entities that were both wholly owned subsidiaries of Bennett Consulting Group. Brandon had never owned his own company. He had been a minority shareholder in a business controlled by his wife. Every board meeting, every major decision, every contract had been subject to approval from investors he thought were strangers. Those investors had been Victoria all along. Lawrence presented emails between Rebecca and the property managers who handled Hayes Properties accounts. The messages showed detailed discussions about which deals to approve for Brandon and which to reject. They had been guiding his business like parents watching a child play with building blocks. When Brandon had wanted to expand into luxury condominiums 2 years ago, Victoria's team had run the numbers and determined it was too risky. They had quietly blocked the financing. Brandon had blamed the bank and never knew his own wife had protected him from a disastrous decision, the affair documents. Lawrence shifted gears. He produced a new set of documents that made Christine visibly uncomfortable. These were records of credit card transactions, hotel bookings, and restaurant reservations. Each one documented Brandon's affair with Christine over the past 18 months. The expenses were damning. Brandon had taken Christine to expensive restaurants, bought her jewelry, and paid for weekend trips to luxury resorts. Every single purchase had been made with a credit card linked to an account funded by Victoria's investments. Lawrence let that sink in for a moment before delivering the final blow. Brandon had used his wife's money to wine and dine the lawyer who was now trying to take everything from her. The irony was almost poetic. Judge Bradford asked Christine if she had known about Brandon's financial situation before beginning their relationship. Christine stammered that she had believed Brandon was wealthy based on his lifestyle and business reputation. She claimed she had no knowledge of Victoria's involvement in Hayes Properties. Lawrence produced text messages between Brandon and Christine where Brandon had explicitly bragged about how much money he would have after divorcing his useless wife. He had promised Christine a life of luxury funded by what he thought was his fortune. The messages were crude and dismissive of Victoria, referring to her with insulting nicknames. Victoria takes the stand. Lawrence called Victoria to testify. She walked to the witness stand with calm dignity. Her voice was clear and steady as she answered questions about her business, her marriage, and her decision to finally reveal the truth. She testified about the day she had met Brandon. She had been attending a charity fundraiser for a children's hospital, one of several organizations Bennett Consulting Group supported. Brandon had approached her, not knowing who she was, and they had talked for hours about real estate and business opportunities. Victoria had been charmed by his passion and drive. She had appreciated that he seemed interested in her thoughts and opinions. Only later did she realize he had been performing, showing her what he thought she wanted to see. She spoke about their courtship and marriage. She admitted that she had made a conscious decision to hide her business identity. She wanted a relationship based on genuine connection, not money or status. She had hoped Brandon would love her for who she was, not what she owned. The years of silence. The courtroom listened in rapt attention as Victoria described her marriage. She talked about the gradual changes in Brandon's behavior. How he had started making decisions without consulting her. How he had discouraged her from maintaining friendships. How he had criticized everything she did. She testified about business dinners where Brandon had introduced her as just my wife, dismissing her attempts to contribute to conversations about real estate markets. She spoke about times when she had offered business advice and Brandon had laughed at her, telling her to stick to things she understood. The most painful moments had been watching Brandon take credit for successes that Victoria's team had engineered. He would come home celebrating a deal he had closed, never knowing that Victoria's analysts had identified the property, structured the financing, and smoothed the regulatory approval process. Victoria's voice remained steady, but there was unmistakable sadness in her words. She had wanted so badly to believe that Brandon would eventually see her as an equal. She had convinced herself that his behavior was just insecurity that would fade as his business grew. Instead, his success had made him more arrogant and dismissive. The decision to reveal. Judge Bradford asked Victoria why she had chosen now to reveal everything. Why had she waited until the divorce proceedings to show her hand? Victoria's answer was simple and devastating. She had discovered the affair 6 months ago. She had been hurt but willing to discuss separation quietly and fairly. Brandon had responded by filing for divorce and demanding she leave with nothing. He had told his friends she was a gold digger trying to steal his hard-earned fortune. The final insult had been today in this courtroom. Listening to Christine mock her as lazy and worthless. Watching Brandon and his friends laugh at the woman they thought was helpless and defeated. That was when Victoria had decided they needed to learn a lesson about judging people by appearances. She looked directly at Brandon as she spoke. Her gaze was not angry or vindictive. It was simply truthful and unbearably sad. She had loved him once. She had believed in him. He had destroyed that love through his own arrogance and cruelty. The financial reckoning. Lawrence presented the final set of documents. These detailed Victoria's complete financial portfolio. Properties in Manhattan, London, Tokyo, and Dubai. Investment accounts worth over $200 million. A private jet. Multiple vacation homes. An art collection appraised at $20 million. Brandon owned none of it. The prenuptial agreement he had insisted on protected assets he knew about at the time of marriage. Since Victoria had revealed nothing about her wealth, the prenup covered virtually nothing of importance. Hayes Properties, the business Brandon thought was his greatest achievement, was revealed to be worth approximately $8 million. Of that, Brandon's 30% share was worth roughly $2.4 million. It was a respectable sum, but nothing compared to what he had been claiming. Lawrence also revealed outstanding debts. Brandon had taken personal loans against his share of Hayes Properties to fund his lavish lifestyle. After accounting for those debts, his actual net worth was closer to $1 million. The man who had walked into court claiming to be worth $45 million was actually a millionaire on paper only. Meanwhile, the woman he had dismissed as worthless controlled an empire worth hundreds of millions. The judgment. Judge Bradford called for closing statements. Christine stood, but she had nothing left to argue. She made a brief statement requesting that the court divide assets fairly under state law. Her earlier aggressive demands were forgotten. She no longer even tried to claim Victoria deserved nothing. Lawrence stood and made his closing argument. He was not asking for alimony or support payments. Victoria did not need Brandon's money. She was asking for the court to officially recognize the truth of their financial situations and divide any jointly held assets appropriately. However, Lawrence did request one thing. He asked that Brandon be required to repay the $5 million Victoria had invested in Hayes Properties over the past 3 years. Since Brandon had fraudulently accepted investment funds while conducting an affair and planning to divorce his wife, the investments should be considered loans to be repaid with interest. Brandon looked like he might be sick. Christine frantically whispered in his ear, but there was nothing she could do. The documentation was complete and irrefutable. Judge Bradford took less than 15 minutes to reach his decision. He ruled that the prenuptial agreement was valid but applied only to the minimal assets it specifically covered. Victoria's business holdings remained entirely hers. Brandon would keep his 30% share of Hayes' properties, but he was ordered to repay Victoria's investments over a 10-year period. Additionally, Brandon was ordered to pay all court costs and legal fees for both parties. The judge noted dryly that the costs would be substantial given the caliber of attorneys involved. The aftermath. The courtroom cleared slowly. Brandon sat motionless at his table, staring at nothing. His dreams of a wealthy divorce settlement had evaporated. His reputation as a self-made businessman was destroyed. His affair with Christine now looked pathetic rather than glamorous. Christine gathered her papers and left without speaking to Brandon. Her relationship with him was finished. She had no interest in a man with limited assets and massive debt. The ambitious lawyer had chosen the wrong side, and everyone in legal circles would soon know it. Victoria stood at the window again, looking out at the city. Rebecca joined her, and they spoke quietly about returning to London for an upcoming business meeting. Lawrence and his team packed their materials efficiently, their work complete. The final words. Brandon finally found the courage to approach Victoria. He stood a few feet away, unable to meet her eyes. He asked in a broken voice why she had done this to him. Why had she hidden everything? Why had she let him believe he was successful? Victoria turned to face him. Her expression held no anger, only a deep weariness. She told him that she had not done anything to him. She had given him opportunities, supported his dreams, and hoped he would grow into a better person. He had chosen to become arrogant and cruel instead. She explained that real success is not about money or status. It is about character, integrity, and how you treat people who have less power than you. Brandon had failed every test of character their marriage had presented. Victoria walked past him toward the exit. Rebecca and Lawrence followed. At the doorway, Victoria paused and looked back one final time. She told Brandon that she hoped he would learn from this experience. True power does not come from money or position. It comes from knowing who you are and never needing to prove it to anyone. Then she left, walking out of the courtroom and out of Brandon's life forever. The woman who had been mocked and dismissed had taught everyone present an unforgettable lesson. Appearances can deceive. Quiet strength often hides behind humble exteriors. And those who judge others by surface appearances may discover too late that they have underestimated the most powerful person in the room. Brandon stood alone in the empty courtroom, surrounded by the wreckage of his arrogance. He had lost everything that mattered, not because his wife was cruel, but because he had never bothered to see who she really was. The fluorescent lights continued to buzz overhead, but Brandon no longer noticed them. He was too busy realizing that the biggest mistake of his life had been treating his greatest asset like his biggest burden. By the time he understood that lesson, it was far too late to matter.